Yeah, so two things that I hadn't really thought about before. Excuse me if the dog comes wandering in the room. So two things I hadn't thought about before: satellite IoT as a term, and then secondly, clearly the need for security if you're going to be beaming down data to critical industrial processes up and down actually. What does the security of that signal look like, and can it be interrupted? So the Industry IoT Consortium it started its industrial internet framework and also a maturity model for security for IoT devices that are going to be using this, I guess, satellite communication. This also makes sense to me for IoT devices that, I mean, if you have really tiny small sensors and you want to distribute them and get as much information as possible from them, it makes it so much harder to deploy them at any scale if they have to have a hard line connection. So this really kind of does open the idea of real edge computing, kind of like a net of sensors that are just everywhere. And the utility for that, I mean, it can scale in so many different directions. Just one off the top of my mind would be actual carbon credit tracking to make sure that specific trees are being moved, nutrients in soil for farming. All of this kind of just makes sense that you wouldn't want to have to run wires, right? So I think this is a great advancement in IoT tech. It kind of shows maturity that we weren't seeing before, and it kind of rolls into what I was talking about with smart cities last week. So, who wants to comment first?
I have kind of a thought on this too, is that IoT, even when it, kind of started, got this bad rap for being unsecure, right? Like it just, my toaster's talking to my, laundry,
My fridge.
my fridge and everything like that, right? So I'm wondering kind of this, Industry IoT Consortium, do you think they'll have an impact on the consumer devices as well? Because it's a two-way street, right? Your device has to talk to your recipient, gathering the data. So, when you're talking these industrial applications, you can put security at the recipient side, but you might also have to put security at the transmission side. So I'm just kind of a little bit curious as to how they're going to kind of, kind of sway the industry to kind of adopt that on both sides, because it does kind of have to be a partnership and a collaboration to make sure that that transmission of information is actually secure on both ends.
Yeah, I would assume, because I'm generally cynical about these things, that it would mostly be incidental for how it trickles down to the consumer. So we've produced this specific thing for a commercial or industrial process. Just so happens that we could also sell these to consumers because consumer demand for that security, as much as we hear it, it doesn't actually filter back to them not buying it, right? Insecure products, and ultimately that's what going to drive what I think consumer products are made. You know, Jennifer, any comments from the spectrum side on this, or even
Yeah,
just from the security and law side?
I had a similar thought to Carla. I was wondering as I was reading it why there was this focus on industrial versus commercial. And then I was just thinking about industrial IoT in terms of, the bandwidth and latency required in order to provide the level of service needed to serve industry, and thinking that it makes some sense to me that you might be able to accomplish some of this on satellite. And if you really did focus it on industrial versus commercial, you might have enough bandwidth available to actually provide a pretty good service with a decent latency rating. But that might not be possible if you open that up to commercial, just because there's, so many more people trying to get on, and that just impacts the bandwidth and the latency. So I was curious from that point of view if you thought that these IoT standards for industrial use and for the security of that information really is intentionally industrial and only industrial, and won't ever sort of morph over to the commercial sector.
I think
I
it's
don't know. It seems like they're really, well, first of all, it's focused on satellite connectivity specifically, kind of linking back to your article, Jennifer. But also, my guess is if they're focused on industrial purposes, there's probably a direct connection to critical infrastructure and securing that, right? Because we've all seen some recent glitches over the last year or so, whether it was, natural disaster kind of issues, right, in Texas with power lines going down, due to freezing and things like this, or, a drone in Pennsylvania that they saw, right, with like those copper wires hanging down that was maybe targeting a power grid there a couple years ago, but just became public last summer. So my guess is the security, they're focusing first on the government side of the house and the stakeholders that have a direct connection to critical infrastructure as kind of a starting point, and then figuring out how well that's working and then go from there. I mean, when you think about satellites, I think it was you, Jennifer, that said SpaceX throwing up, these thousands of small LEO satellites, low Earth orbit satellites. I'm nerding out a little bit here. I just wrote an article last week that's going to come out inside GNSS magazine, about all the threats to a space-based position navigation timing, PNT. And that includes not just, there is a thing called space weather. Surprise if you didn't know that. Some pretty extreme weather conditions can occur in space, but also, accidents, accidental, there's a lot of dead satellites up there, and you don't need a big satellite to crash that's dead and just merely floating around as space junk or space debris to crash into another satellite to cause a problem. All you need is like a BB-sized something or other to hit a satellite, because we're talking, speed, the speed of a bullet is the speed these things are traveling around in space to cause really a catastrophic incident. And so this idea of security in space, this idea of resiliency of our satellites, and when something goes bad, this is like, I guess, bread and butter for you, Jennifer, and your firm. Who is responsible and who is responsible for removing that debris. That's a very big issue in international law. I'm sure, as you know, Jennifer, under some of the treaties, it's the states themselves that have the responsibility for essentially ownership of the assets they put up there. And if they create debris, then, so it's almost like the Wild Wild West in essence up there when it comes to some of these issues. And I think there is a lot of work to be done. It's very exciting to see these developments, but it's also great that people like the IIC are thinking about security, even if it's just for a sliver of, maybe the users out there.
Well, yeah, I mean, these are large concerns, right? Well, you go, Jennifer.
Oh, no, Mike, please go ahead.
No, I think that, I don't really have that much to say, but that, given what Dawn's saying, we tend to think of like satellite stuff as out of sight, out of mind, but there's a lot more that goes into it in terms of what actually makes what SpaceX is doing kind of phenomenal, and it does seem like satellite has some issues that terrestrial-based stuff doesn't. So, in the case of providing extra gap coverage, yeah, that's fantastic, but in the terms of being like a consistent signal, that might lead into what Jennifer was saying about this is why they're kind of trying to keep the scope down to industrial processes, because they can only really guarantee it at that level for a few big stakeholders rather than millions of little consumers tagging the system all at once all the time.
Yeah, and I
Go ahead.
Oh,
I'm
sorry, Carla. I'll just jump in real fast. I was also thinking about this in terms of, as we think about the need to secure satellite communications, certainly we've been working on that on the ground, and there's been so much concern about securing our networks, and there is this Secure Networks Act, and it all gets into the supply chain and what is part of the network and how are we securing that, and who's subject to that, and is it just network equipment or does it go beyond that, and the importance of doing that. And I think as we, I've been working in the Secure Networks Act pieces on the ground and the terrestrial networks, and I hadn't actually considered the need to do that with the satellites. maybe I was assuming some level of encryption that was going to make that more sort of bulletproof. But so I thought it was very interesting that there's a whole group working on ensuring this security because perhaps it wasn't as secure as I had assumed. Over to you, Carla.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that, is that especially when we first started developing those small satellites, those things that could be, developed in a year and thrown up, en masse, from NASA and from private companies, there was very little that was stopping anybody from basically putting something up other than the fact that it had to fit on that particular, payload to go out to be launched. So there's I think there were a lot of great experimentation happening at that point, but also it was very Wild Westy, like Don said. There was not a big guideline that everybody said, oh, okay, you have to minimum encrypt or you have to not broadcast XYZ, other than a couple protected wavelengths there. And there's just a lot of stuff up there, and there's going to be a lot more stuff up there because the space flight's getting easier to get stuff up. The commercial payloads are increasing, the development of small sats is increasing, and I think starting from the industrial side is probably the most critical thing to get right, but I think that those could inform guidelines for future launches, for future devices that are getting up there going forward. If we can start with like a baseline framework that maybe then we can adapt or adjust up and down, depending on if it's consumer or, military or something else. But I think that this is a good step forward just to get started with trying to set some standards for how this communication is going to happen.
Yeah, it reminds me of that movie, Night at the Museum. We're Americans. We don't think, so many times it's like security is an afterthought.
Yes.
But it should be built into every regulation process up front. Think about this for a second, like just the drone situation, right? 2016, the small UAS rule comes out. Just now, people are talking about security, right? Remote ID just came out last year. And because Congress kind of forced that in 2018 in the FAA Reauthorization Act, like, hey, you guys really need to think about like identifying who's up there. So, this idea of security and the importance of it, I hope, when we think about other emerging technologies and use cases, things like eVTOL aircraft, advanced air mobility, that some of this stuff, because there's working groups now, you both know this, everybody probably watching this knows this, some congressionally mandating working groups. I hope they're baking security in up front. I hope they're thinking about this from the start, looking at lessons learned, right? Why not? I mean, it's hard work, we know that, but like let's roll up the sleeves and get that done.